Okay, my friends, my name is Gerdes. It is Wednesday, December 4th, and this is 5, maybe 6, depending on how you cut it, big stories. So, as I look at what's happening in Georgia, Georgia is looking very much like Kyiv in 2014. This is about a week of protests now in Georgia after the Georgia Dream Party said that they're not going to be involved in European integration till at least 2028, if that. Okay, so searches and arrests are taking place in the offices of almost all of the major opposition parties in Georgia. Nothing will cause Tbilisi to become the Euromaidan in Georgia faster than doing exactly what they're doing. 6 coalition leaders, or people who have actively coordinated the protests, are known to have been detained. This is how a government goes from the problem of protests to having a revolution. And that's very, very likely if they keep pushing their luck. This is Tbilisi tonight as the Russian-backed government attempts to disperse protesters with the largest forces to date. Like, look at all these guys decked out with all their gear on and their shields, and yep, it's not going to go well for them in Georgia, I don't think. What you could do is be more conciliatory and think, you know what, maybe we ought to readdress this issue and talk about whether we should, or to what degree we should be looking at European integration, or is it off the table, or let's talk about this reasonably. But if you know nothing but force, then you just push force, and they feel like they have the backing of the Russians, which the Russians seem a little bit too thinly spread to actually help them. Okay, next big story. Let's turn our attention to Syria, where rebel forces capture another village in the plains in the countryside. Now, the rebels have been pushing forward, taking parts of Aleppo, and now these aren't good rebels. Like, there are better rebels and less good rebels. These are those that are kind of former ISIS, that broke away from ISIS, that still want an Islamic state, but they all hate Assad. So these guys are making some progress. Syrian rebels continue their push into the Syrian desert and reach the town of Suruj, deep in the Hama province. Okay, now Ryan Macbeth was actually really helpful here in providing an idiot's guide to the Syrian civil war faction. So if you're not familiar with who's on which side, okay, this will clarify pretty well. There's Bashar al-Assad, that's the president of Syria. He's in charge of everything Syrian. And then you have Russia, longtime ally of Syria. And then you have Iran, who has trained the militia in Syria. And then you have Hezbollah, who needs Syria as a training ground to conduct and acquire weapons from Iran. And then you also have, and he added to this, Tulsi Gabbard. She may soon be the director of national intelligence, and now I don't think she'll be confirmed by the Senate. And he says, I wish I was making this up. This is the bad team. Now, this is the mixed bad, mixed good team over here. This is anti-Assad forces. So you have HTS. Those are the guys, the Islamic militia currently making gains near Aleppo. And then you have Haras al-Din. It's another al-Qaeda affiliated but anti-ISIS group, because even al-Qaeda and ISIS don't necessarily like each other. And then you have Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. These are Kurd forces fighting ISIS and Assad. They're also backed by the US. And then you have the People's Protection Unit. It's a Kurdish component of the SDF. Now, they've also fought with Turkey, so Turkey doesn't like them. Well, Turkey doesn't like the Kurds for a number of reasons. Then you have the Free Syrian Army, which is just rebels that don't like Assad, that were formerly part of Assad's team and now have gone somewhere else. And then you have the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. But all these guys are anti-Assad, and all these players are working with the Assad government in Syria in order to hold things together. That's a quick guide to who's what. Now, retreating Syrian government army abandoned 3 T-90A tanks, as well as T-72M and T-55 tanks and BMP-1. Thus, at least 5 more modern Russian tanks fell into the hands of the opposition rebels. And those opposition rebels would have been the HTS, the Islamic militia, making gains in Aleppo. Okay. The airport in Aleppo is a graveyard of planes and choppers. Many are old, but there are also some recently destroyed vehicles. The airport was swarmed by drones shortly before the rebels moved into Aleppo. Now, does that sound familiar? Drone warfare, it's being imported from learning lessons from Ukraine. It should also be noted that Assad's infamous barrel bombers have completely disappeared. I can only speculate, but my best guess is that the usage of FPV drones, which caused havoc among among Russian choppers in Ukraine and Russia is also being employed by Syrian rebels. So they're learning these lessons. Russia's backing Assad. And it's like, this is all connected. I keep telling you it's all connected. Now, what are barrel bombers? Now, this is an older news article from 2021. In 9 years, the Syrian regime has dropped nearly 82,000 barrel bombs, killing 11,087 civilians, including 1,821 children. Now, what are barrel bombs? Barrel bombs are simply this primitive kind of weapon. You fly something over with a barrel full of explosives. The term barrel bomb refers collectively to all locally manufactured containers filled with explosive materials, and then they just drop them on the population. Does it work well? Well, it blows things up, but they're indiscriminately bombing civilians as well as their enemies. So this is why the people aren't really thrilled with the Assad regime. Okay, now, what's the effect on Russia? Well, Russia is beginning to withdraw ships from Tartus as opposition gains in Syria. Now, this is Russia's sole military port in the Mediterranean, which also helps explain Russia's cozy relationship with Syria, because if they're going to have a military port in the Med, they need Syria. U.S. Army commander says that Putin risks losing naval resources in 3 different regions simultaneously: Syria, Black Sea, and Baltic regions. Like, that'll shut them out, except in the Arctic, and that's not really all that hospitable for much of the year. Okay, next big story. Russia and China just rigged the Romanian elections with 10 million fake TikTok accounts. Okay, now that sounds a little overblown. What actually happened was 66,000 fake accounts and 10 million fake followers were just removed from TikTok for Romania's election. So they were using the playbook from Prigozhin's troll farm in St. Petersburg to perhaps sway the Romanian election. The scale is shocking. We're not talking hundreds or thousands of posts, but millions every single day. Now, as Gary Kasparov talks about, it's the scale. People don't seem to realize that it's not a question of a few hundred or a few thousand, but millions of posts every day. That's what's actually happening here. And so it could even turn the election. Now, beyond the election, Russia may be linked to over 100 suspicious incidents in Europe, according to the Czech foreign minister. In 2024, 500 such incidents, including hybrid attacks, espionage, influence operations, were recorded across the EU. We must send Moscow a clear signal that this won't be tolerated. So, yeah, they're doing some bad things, and that's kind of why I was showing you this in one of my thumbnails. Is like Loki, the god of mischief, with Putin's face on it, and that's because that's kind of what it feels like. Okay, let's turn our attention to South Korea. So South Korea had this weird incident yesterday. They declared martial law, and then the parliament overrode the president. And yeah, now I don't know if Russia's hands involved with that or not. I know North Korea would like to mess with what's going on in South Korea. But okay, South Korea's defense minister apologized to citizens and resigned. Quote, "I apologize for causing public confusion about martial law. I will take responsibility for all situations related to martial law," unquote. And so he's resigned. And it looks like the opposition Democrat Party of South Korea plans to charge President Yoon Suk-yeol with treason and launch impeachment proceedings. Now, if you look back over the history, I talked about this yesterday in my 7 big stories yesterday. I talked about how, like, most of these presidents, it seems, were going to jail or impeached or all kinds of things in South. They've had a pretty rough run. Okay, now impeachment requires a 2/3 majority in the 300-seat parliament. The Democratic Party and other opposition parties have 192 seats between them, which means they need at least 8 from the ruling party in order to support impeachment. Whether they'll get it or not, I do not know, but that's what's going on in South Korea. Okay, a couple quick stories and we'll be done. Denmark pledges 6 million euros to restore Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which is absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Denmark. But this didn't need to happen. If they had the air defense, they wouldn't have this problem right now. And it's winter, and I'm in the American South. I feel winter. My hands are cold even now as I'm talking about this. I can only imagine what Ukrainians are going through. Yesterday, I also talked about Hunter Biden A few people in the comments were saying, why did you bring up Hunter Biden when what does this have to do with Ukraine? It has a lot to do with Ukraine. It's the big story is what's going on with Joe Biden and what's he actually willing to do and what's he willing not to do for Ukraine or for his son. And in this case, I was explaining to my mostly majority, 2/3 of my audience I know are international. And so I was explaining yesterday that, look, while this looks kind of corrupt, it's within this American system. He can do this. And the American system has those two remedies, impeachment, and it has, we're not going to reelect you. But Biden was willing to tarnish his legacy. And that's really what this amounts to. And he'll always go down in history as having pardoned his own son here. And he looks quite diminished as a consequence of that. That was my point with the Hunter Biden issue. Gary Kasparov talks about this as well. And by the way, that is a pretty corrupt thing to do, to pardon your son and intervene in justice. Now, of course, others will say, now I'm trying to be as fair as possible, others will say if his last name wasn't Hunter Biden, he wouldn't have been charged with it. But I don't know. Now, you could have to apply that equally. Would Trump have been charged with things if he wasn't Trump? Right? Same kinds of concepts apply. Just be fair to all sides as much as possible. Gary Kasparov talked about it like this. More seriously, the pardon undercuts partisan debate, repoliticizing the justice system. Trump isn't going to do anything differently, but it's vital to keep principled arguments against it front and center. Yeah, you don't want to encourage more weaponizing of the justice system. He talked about it like this, and I thought this was actually pretty funny. I mean, Gary Kasparov is a pretty sharp guy. Biden should have stepped down and let Harris pardon Hunter. This would have also, 1, deliver the first black woman president, and 2, ruin all of Trump's Made in China 45th, 47th president merchandise. I just found that humorous for some reason. Okay, Tucker Carlson. I think this is my last big story. Now, Tucker Carlson's talking about that he's back in Moscow. Why? Because he's going to have another hard-hitting interview like he had with Putin, this time with Lavrov. And he's going to get all of Lavrov's unfiltered talking points. Now, as you hear Tucker introduce this interview, listen to see if these are the kinds of talking points that Putin would like us to hear.
In the week since we left Russia, Moscow, where we are now, in February, after interviewing Vladimir Putin, we've watched from the United States as the Biden administration has driven the U.S. ever closer to a nuclear conflict with Russia, the country that possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It has accelerated ever since, and it's reached its apogee so far in the weeks after Trump's election. He is now the president-elect. In that time, just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration, American military personnel, launched missiles into mainland Russia and killed at least a dozen Russian soldiers. So we are, unbeknownst to most Americans, in a hot war with Russia, an undeclared war, a war you did not vote for and that most Americans don't want, but that is ongoing.
Okay, now, ask yourself, is Tucker acting as a journalist or an advocate here? Because he'll claim that he's a journalist, but he really, really deeply sides with Russia here. And look, I'm not a journalist. I'm just trying to provide context. I tell you what I am on the right up front. I'm a professor providing context. I am all in for Ukraine. I believe that, right? But I don't claim to be a neutral, fair journalist, and that's part of the difference. Gary Kasparov, again, just when you think Tucker can't get any lower, there's a knock from below. And then Julia Davis, who does the Russian Media Monitor, says this: every day I watch Russian experts on state TV complaining that Americans are not afraid of Moscow's nuclear threats and wondering what they can do to scare us in order to dissuade Americans from supporting Ukraine. That's why Tucker is in Moscow. I think there's something very fair about that analysis. Yesterday, a longtime viewer mentioned that she listens to my videos, and it sparked a thought. Hey, maybe I could actually take these same videos, put them out on audio in podcast form, and maybe other people will hear it. So I need you to answer a question for me. I put this out in my polls. How many of you listen rather than watch? Perhaps I should place these on Spotify to spread it. So exclusively watch, hit that, kind of watch, but mostly listen. Tap that, or I just listen. That'll help me understand, is there actually some kind of audience out there to listen to it on podcasts? I'll leave you with this from a Russian dissident. The appeasement of dictators never brings peace. It always leads to more aggression, more suffering, more wars, because dictators do not see compromise as an invitation to compromise back. They see it as a sign of weakness. That's exactly right. Spot on. All right, my friends, that's all that I have for you. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.